Well, hello there, Libromaniacs. Welcome back. Today we're going to be talking about the Copper Scroll. The Copper Scroll is one of the Dead Sea Scrolls. The Dead Sea Scrolls are a library of texts that were found in the mid 1940s in caves beside the Dead Sea. And initially they just found 7 texts, and they thought, based on the location and an analysis of the text, they're like, oh, these appear to be written by the Essenes, the Jewish historian Josephus and the Jewish philosopher Philo, both of the first century, wrote about a sect called the Essenes in that area. And Pliny also writes about a Jewish sect in that area of the Essenes. So that's what the scholars initially surmised. Now, more texts were discovered over the decades, and some of these were in better shape than others. So there was a lot of, putting pieces together, doing, like, they scan them all into a computer, which makes it easier to get the bits put back together. And they worked on it this has been an ongoing process. It took over 40 years from the initial discovery before there was anything published about the Dead Sea Scrolls. And at the outset, there were press releases and whatnot, and the Essene hypothesis was presumed at that time. And 40 years later, when they published everything, it had already become consensus. That was already an established fact that the Essenes wrote these texts. But the Copper Scroll is a little bit of a monkey wrench to that theory. The Copper Scroll is, unlike the other scrolls that are written on parchment, which is leather, and papyrus, the Copper Scroll was literally written on a sheet of copper. It was inscribed into a sheet of metal. And they did that. Well, why would they do that? Why would you inscribe a text on a sheet of metal? Well, it was an important text, and they did not want it to succumb to the elements like papyrus and parchment can easily do. And so it was inscribed on copper, which was a valuable metal and at that time. And excuse me. And I want to read this quote from a book talking about this. So to set up this quote I'm about to read, there was some. John Allegro was one of the scholars involved with this, and he was there when they cut the copper. They couldn't unroll it without damaging it, so they cut it into strips and then put the strips together and were able to read it that way. And he was the one who translated it on the spot. So I'm going to mention his name and another scholar whose last name is Kuhn, Kuhn. They're going to be referenced in this quote. The text that Allegro first transcribed and translated did indeed turn out to contain inventories of hidden treasures, as Kuhn had surmised. According to the scroll's explicit wording, those treasures were stored away in various hiding places, mostly in the Judean wilderness. The text contains a total of 12 columns, about 5 inventories to each, written in a non-literary Hebrew idiom datable to the 1st century AD. The fact that it is written on copper, a valuable metal, suggests that the authors attached importance to it. It bears all the hallmarks of a genuine documentary autograph. The writing does not exhibit the elegance and consistency of professional scribes, and the inventories are given without embellishment. As in the Bar Kokhba texts, genuine toponyms of the Judean wilderness are found in the Copper Scroll. They include such familiar places as Jericho, the Valley of Achor, and the Wadi Qidron, as well as localities that are for the most part unidentifiable, such as Sekhata, Haroba, Duke, Kolat, Milham, and Beth Hakerem. The hiding places of the treasures include caves, tombs, and aqueducts. There are a great many treasures, deviating significantly in size and character from one another. So authentic is the Copper Scroll that the foremost continental proponent of the Qumran-Essene hypothesis, Dupont Sommer, described it as, quote, a document drafted with all the baldness of bookkeeping, unquote, and suggested that it, quote, the reason for it having been engraved on a resistant material and kept in 2 copies is that it was a very important archive, not of invented riches, but of very real ones, end quote. Now that means the Qumran-Essene hypothesis, how does a group of 4,000 Essenes have all these treasures? That doesn't sit well with the Essene hypothesis, that all this gold and silver and these valuable treasures were in the possession of a group of 4,000 people living communal lifestyles out in the desert. So, in another paragraph, Dr. Norman Gold writes, now he's also in this paragraph, he's talking about some other scholars, DeVoe, Milik, and I think there's another author in here, another scholar's name in here that's just their last name. But anyways, the paragraph reads, we may thus reasonably infer that it only slowly dawned upon DeVoe, Milik, and others in Jerusalem that the contents of the Copper Scroll, if taken at face value, represented a danger to the Qumran-Essene hypothesis. The 4,000 wealth-eschewing Essenes of the 1st century AD Palestine could not have had anything like the quantities of silver and other precious metals described in the text, nor could any other small sect. If the text was indeed an authentic autograph, its treasures could have only come from the temple, whose custodians in intertestamental times amassed great sums of wealth from temple dues and donations provided by a large, widespread population of Jews both in and outside of Palestine. And since this scroll has been found in one of the caves along with literary manuscripts written on parchment, the possibility must have become suddenly apparent that the scrolls as a whole could be conceived of as having derived not from Qumran, but from Jerusalem itself. Convinced, however, that they must be right in their view that the Essenes had written the scrolls, and that this had been accomplished at Khirbet Qumran, the principal scroll team members decided to declare the text before them a work of fiction. So in order to reconcile the differences, they just declared it a work of fiction. So you don't have to reconcile the differences. You can just say, oh, they just made it up and wrote it on a valuable metal just for kicks, to make it seem more, believable or something, to make the work of fiction more authentic in some way, which doesn't make any sense. I shouldn't say it doesn't make any sense. Like, if you were to statistically estimate the probability of that, you would put it in single digits. Like it would be, okay, maybe, I'm 7% confident that could be true in that scenario. The more likely scenario is this is authentic treasures from the Second Temple, the Temple of Jerusalem. And these locations are, and that's actually what Allegro thought. Allegro actually, in the 1960s, he got a team together to find these locations, even though many of them are using ancient names for the locations that nobody knows what they stand for anymore. They went hunting for these treasures, and they did come up empty-handed, but that doesn't mean it's not an authentic text from the Temple of Jerusalem. And that is also mentioned in that second paragraph, is that, well, why do all these texts that we found near the Dead Sea have to be Essene texts? Could they have also all come from the Temple in Jerusalem, which would explain a lot of things? A lot of mysteries that are around this whole Essene hypothesis would be resolved with that, because the Essenes didn't write them. One of the problems is that there's literally 400 to 500 different scribal hands different handwritings that are used. Now, any scholar will tell you that's an absurdly large number for a group of 4,000 Essenes. They should probably only have, a half dozen to maybe at most a dozen scribal hands writing these texts, not 400 to 500. Unless you're like, hey, Rome's coming. The Roman troops are on their way here, or maybe they weren't actually en route, but maybe the writing was already on the wall at that time that, hey, we're going to war with Rome. And we better have copies of everything in the temple buried. So that way, if we get razed to the ground, which they did, you would be able to rediscover what was written in the temple, or the books that were in the temple library. You would be able to find those down the road. And that may well be the case. According to several scholars, most notably Dr. Norman Golb, who wrote a book called Who Wrote the Dead Sea Scrolls? The Search for the Secret of Qumran, he has come to the conclusion that the temple library hypothesis is the most likely explanation of the Dead Sea Scrolls, which is astonishing because, for starters, we always have the destruction of libraries throughout history. The Library of Alexandria, the Library of Byzantium. There's all these Pergamon library. There's all these libraries that were destroyed, and we never recovered anything. We don't even know where the libraries are. We just have references to them in some scattered books that happen to survive the Holocaust of books. Well, the one exception happens to be the Dead Sea Scrolls. Here's a library of the Second Temple that might have all been buried out in the Dead Sea, and we literally have not only have found the first lost library, but it happens to be of Jewish text. Judeo-Christianity being, the Judeo-Christian tradition being, 1/3 of the planet identifies as either Christian or Jewish, and that affects Islam too. There's 2 billion Islamic people out there. All these people are built upon the foundation of the Jewish text, the Jewish temple. That started monotheism. And here we might have found that entire library. So the question remains is the Copper Scroll a work of fiction, as these scholars have declared? Or is it a legitimate inventory? And if so, it's a treasure map to the Second Temple. That's astonishing. That is all astonishing.